Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Hannah Weinberger, and I'm chairing this special council meeting. I'm calling this special council meeting to order now. We've gathered this evening for a very special purpose, to go through consultation materials from the ministry and a proposed RCDSO response. Although this is a special meeting of council, our process and approach this evening will follow that of regular council meetings. We will go through some preliminary remarks and matters, and you'll hear from both Dan and Sandy. Then we'll move into the decision item. As with all our council meetings, this special meeting of council is being live streamed and available through the RCDSO's YouTube channel, enabling members of the public, profession, and other stakeholders to observe our proceedings. So I'll just remind council members to please turn on their video and to use either the chat or the hand raise function when you wish to speak. I'll be working to facilitate your discussion and manage our time effectively this evening. Before we proceed any further, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. Today in this virtual space, we wish to acknowledge the land on which our college sits. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wyandot, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. But with many of us so far away from the RCDSO building, we invite you to reflect upon the traditional lands in your area, which are home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge and honor the ancestors on those traditional lands we are on today. We stand in solidarity to murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, transgender, trans-identifying, and two-spirited people. Thank you. I will now ask the RCDSO Registrar, Dan Faulkner, to do the council roll call.
Thank you, Hanno. So as always, I will go in alphabetical order. Nalan Bargava.
Present.
David Bishop.
Come on. Yeah, present.
Thank you, David. Amelia Chan.
Present.
Ram Chopra.
Present.
Jamie Colliver.
Present.
Christina Cordero.
Present.
Peter Delane.
Present.
Nancy DeSanto.
Present.
Mark Eckler.
Present.
Ellie Fisher.
Present.
Vivian Hu.
Present.
Richard Hunter.
Present.
Benjamin Lynn.
Present.
David Mock.
Present.
Joseph Richards.
Present.
Harinder Sandhu.
Present.
Gildo Santos.
Present.
Brian Smith.
Present.
Usama Solomon.
Present.
Rod Stapleforth.
Present.
Mark Trudell.
Present.
Sandy Venditti.
Present.
Jack Wasserman.
Present.
Judy Welikovich.
Present.
And Cam Whitmer.
Present.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And before we move on, I would just like to remind you that even though we did ask all members of council to leave their video on, I would ask that unless you are speaking, you mute yourself, and that'll cut down on any of the background feedback that we may be getting. So we will please ask you to do that. I'm now going to ask for the President's remarks to turn it over to you, Dr. Sandy Venditti.
Thank you, Hanno, and good evening, Council. It's great to see you all. I'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for taking the time to accommodate this special meeting this evening. I really appreciate your patience, your flexibility, and your support. However, we wouldn't be here tonight without the hardworking staff that put all of these materials together. So a special thanks to Dan and his great team who helped with the submission, in particular, Andrea Foti, Kevin Marsh, Jeff Goldberg, Kelly Tripp, Michelle Tremblay, Hilary Bauer, Jillian Slaughter, Dana Simon, and Lara Thacker. These individuals diligently worked around the clock to put this together. So thank you so very much for your unwavering dedication and commitment to the college. As Hanno mentioned, our primary goal for tonight's meeting is to discuss a significant proposal from the Ministry of Health, which sets out a number of broad reforms related to health regulatory governance and modernization. The implications of the ministry's proposed reforms are significant, and the timelines the college has been given to respond are very short. You've seen in the briefing note that senior staff and the executive committee have worked as quickly as possible to review the ministry's proposal and develop a draft response for council's review and feedback. Tonight, in this public setting, we would like to have a discussion with all of council and seek your input on these proposed reforms. In terms of the draft response, the positions set out are exactly that, merely a draft. Given the short timelines, we wanted to be able to propose concrete options in order to facilitate our discussion this evening. So basically, to give you something to react to. This evening, council will be taken through each section of the draft response and given a chance to ask questions and provide feedback, including proposed revisions. To use our time as wisely as possible, please focus on the content, not editorial comments or wordsmithing. We want to make sure that we understand your thoughts and direction about the substance. Then senior staff will work with the executive committee to make sure the specific language and tone are right and reflect council's direction as we prepare the response for submission to the ministry. You'll see that the draft response addresses each of the proposed reforms. It is certainly an option for council to remain silent on some things and not comment. However, there are some implications with that approach. Remaining silent does not mean that the ministry will not proceed with this work and that changes won't apply to the RCDSO. It will mean that the RCDSO will have missed the opportunity to shape and influence the outcome. So please keep that in mind as we go through each section. As with all council meetings, diversity of thought is always welcomed and appreciated and leads to better decision-making. The ministry has been clear that they are looking to colleges to assist them in evaluating these significant changes. And that can include stating that we disagree or that we'd like the ministry to provide more information or reconsider their proposed reforms. So please speak up and voice your opinions. So thank you again, council. I'm looking forward to hearing your views on this important work. Hanno, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Before I ask members of council to declare any conflict of interest, I remind you that conflicts are important to declare because of our public interest mandate and as a standard reflected in the college performance measurement framework. Do any members of council have a conflict of interest with any aspect of the topic that is going to be discussed today? Seeing none, I thank you, and we will move on. We'll move now to the substance of this meeting. We have one single item for this evening's meeting, and it is an item for the council's decision. In your meeting package, you have a briefing note and two appendices. The briefing note provides council with some background and highlights from both the ministry's proposed reforms and the RCDSO's draft response. Appendix A is the consultation material circulated by the ministry. And Appendix B is the draft RCDSO response. We've structured this evening's meeting to go through all of these materials thoroughly. Dan Faulkner and Andrea Foti are going to be supporting counsel, and we're also joined by a few college staff who are subject matter experts and who helped evaluate the potential implications of the ministry's proposed reforms. Here's how we'll proceed this evening. Dan is going to start us off by providing some comments and governance reform in general and the work that has been taking place in the broader regulatory landscape for the past several years. Andrea will then take counsel through a PowerPoint slide deck where she'll outline the key elements of the ministry's proposed reforms and take counsel through the RCDSO's draft response. The draft response is broken into 4 major areas. Andrea will pause at the end of each for council discussion and feedback. I will facilitate this discussion. We aren't going to have separate motions related to each section of the draft response. Instead, we'll go with the consensus vote on any amendments. Council members we will go with a consensus vote on any amendments council members propose in individual sections, and we'll have just one motion at the end of this meeting. The motion we will consider is whether council approves the draft submission, subject to any amendments council requests, and directs that it be forwarded to the ministry in accordance with its February 23rd, 2022 deadline. As always, when we come to each opportunity for discussion, I will ask any council members who wish to make comments or pose questions to use the chat function or the raise hand function. That will help me keep an accurate speakers list and make sure that I can get to as many of you as possible while still managing our time tonight. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dan to kick things off. Dan.
Thank you, Hanno, and good evening, Council. I just want to echo Sandy's comments and thank you for finding the time to attend this special meeting to discuss this very important topic of governance reform. This college and council, as you know, have a long history of leadership and governance, and you've demonstrated this in a variety of ways, including most recently with the creation of a competency-based election process for professional members of council and a competency-based appointment process to committees. And that's just one example of how RCDSO's councils evolve to address a fairly rapidly changing governance environment. You have resource materials that you have seen from the past several years, and you've heard from college leaders over the years about a variety of governance issues. I'm not going to go into any detail. It's impossible to try to capture all of the things that have occurred with respect to governance over the last 5 to 10 years. And you've reviewed this topic. You've reviewed it considerably, but some of the changes to note that I want to be clear on with all of council. You've heard about health profession regulatory governance changes in other jurisdictions and professions, including the UK, and I believe that you had someone from Ireland speak to you a few years ago. You've heard about health profession regulatory governance reforms across the country, most notably in British Columbia, where colleges there are being amalgamated, and the board structures are changing in similar, if not the same ways to the material that you're being asked to consider this evening. And you've also heard in part over the last year or so about regulatory reforms here in Ontario in other sectors. So including the Ontario College of Teachers, which has recently implemented a series of similar reforms and has since appointed a new council and numerous committees in early 2022. And there's also the new Oversight and Accountability Organization in Ontario that I presented to you in a briefing note, probably about spring of last year, and that was Bill 283. And it will regulate personal support workers and would also be established in a very different structure than we know in health colleges to regulate potentially other health professions. Bringing it closer to home, RCDSO's council held that symposium that I mentioned with governance experts from Ontario, Ireland, and Australia. And there's no single right answer to issues that we discuss related to governance. But there are definitely patterns and themes emerging and becoming established that converge strongly on the changes that we will discuss this evening. And those patterns and themes are happening across the country and around the world. Several Ontario colleges you've heard about, they've studied governance, they've developed future-oriented proposals for government to consider in any new legislation and reform initiatives. Notably, this includes the colleges of nurses, pharmacists, and naturopaths. Several colleges have tried to implement as much of those recommendations as possible, where legislative amendments would not be required, but this can only go so far. And those colleges that I mentioned in Ontario, they've been working with the Ministry of Health to enact these changes, which mirror the proposals that have been put forward over the past 5 years and which are consistent with the reforms that you're seeing this evening. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is this is happening. This is moving forward. The reforms related to counsel that you'll discuss about smaller boards, equal public and profession representation, separation of council membership from committee membership, and the appointment of public and professional members to boards. These reforms have been discussed for several years, a long time. And this consultation is clearly framed around how to implement these changes, traps to watch for, things that we can do to make it as seamless as possible. And I expect that these reforms come as no surprise to many of you. And I say this to help set the context for our newer council members. Some of you have not been around this table for more than a year, and also to remind those who've been leading on this issue for several years. So as I said, these reforms have been coming for some time. The ministry is signaling that this is an important policy direction, and they're asking for help from colleges about how to move forward responsibly, with what no doubt will be a lot of moving parts when we get to the implementation stage. We don't have legislation yet, and we don't have a precise timeline, but I think it's fair for us to assume that this could happen sooner rather than later. It could happen before the election in June. We are on top of that to try to understand the legislative agenda if this is going to move forward, but that's not information that we have for you this evening. Your role tonight. Since January 26, as has been mentioned, staff and the executive committee have been working to develop this draft document to help frame your discussion. The content is yours to shape. As staff, we will provide you with any advice or information that you wish from us, and we will finalize the response based on your direction. And I respect that some or many of you will feel like there's not enough information here, but this is the information that we have with all of that historical context. And it may in fact be to our benefit that we can help shape the implementation of some of these really complex changes that will occur. And as the reforms become translated into legislation, there are obviously going to be further opportunities to see more detail and respond in kind at that point. So this council is well positioned. You have lots of talent and experience in this area to support effective transition and change management with your input. I've seen it before from this council at RCDSO with issues like the regulatory response to sexual abuse of patients and transparency of information to the public. Very big issues that you moved forward in a very masterful way. And we've also had recent acknowledgement in the college performance measurement framework of some of our innovations. Over the past couple of weeks, I've certainly heard from some of you about your thoughts and questions, and you've raised some really important concepts, and I know they'll be explored tonight, and I'm looking forward to that. You've mentioned things like the impact of moving from elections to appointments. Who's going to make those appointments? How will the profession be engaged in regulation with these changes? That's a very important question, and I think that we have to consider not just this evening, but moving forward. So all of these are critical topics. We won't wrestle all of them to the ground tonight, but I think we'll make some important strides. So I look very forward to your thoughtful responses, and I'll turn it over to Andrea, who will walk through the document.
Thank you, Dan. I'm just going to get my slide deck up, Council. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you. Okay. Can someone just give me a thumbs up? Can you see that deck? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So my task today is I'm going to take you through a really high-level overview of the proposed reforms and the draft response. I'm going to keep my comments really high-level and fairly brief because we want to really allow the maximum amount of time for your discussion. So if what you see on the screen seems like quite a summary version, that's intentional, and you obviously have the fuller detail in your council package. Okay, so starting with the proposed reforms, you heard the timelines that we've been given. Reforms have been announced in these 4 areas, quite disparate. We'll go through them in detail one by one. In terms of the core governance reforms, as you saw, these bring in significant changes to council and committees. As Dan mentioned a minute ago and Sandy covered, these are changes that really we've seen in a number of other jurisdictions. All of these elements really by this stage have become known as their best practices in governance reform. So I won't read them all out, but I've captured them in summary form in the 2 gray boxes there. In terms of housekeeping and modernization, the ministry is proposing some changes. Housekeeping is exactly as it sounds. They're looking to remove some outdated provisions and terms. Notably, they're proposing some changes to terminology. And you can see those outlined, and those are similar to changes that we've seen in terminology elsewhere. In terms of modernization, this is very significant, and these are newer changes we haven't seen before or really heard of before. And essentially, the ministry is proposing changes in the oversight to which colleges are subject. So firstly, proposing that colleges be subject to the French Language Services Act, and that will include having the French Language Services Commissioner be able to hear complaints if individuals deal with the colleges and don't have a level of access to French to a degree that they wish or are entitled to, or that we're required to provide. They can make a complaint to the French Language Services Commissioner. So that would bring that entity into our orbit. The Auditor General is proposed that colleges be subject to the Auditor General. Those of you who are familiar with the Auditor General's work will know that office does audits that are both related to finances, but also more broadly, something called value for money audits, which from what we can tell are very far ranging. They're sort of, quite a broad scope. And lastly, another oversight mechanism related to complaints and discipline decision-making processes. So the information that we have is that this isn't about outcomes. This is about decision-making process. The ministry has proposed the patient ombudsman could be one potential entity who could fulfill that role. I just want to be clear that all 3 of these levels are oversight in addition to any oversight the college currently has. So no existing oversight is coming off the table. This is 3 added to the table. In terms of registration practices, the ministry is proposing some ideas and options. These very much align with recent communications we've had out of the Fairness Commissioner's office. There's a lot of consistency there. But proposing to remove any Canadian experience requirements, to impose time limits on registration decisions. So those are decisions by the registration committee. To standardize language proficiency requirements. Those exist for each college, and the ministry is proposing that those be unified across colleges. And lastly, to look at expediting registration in emergencies. So no surprise where that's coming from. Our experience with COVID-19 is that there's a bit of a patchwork approach across colleges, with some colleges being able to register in an expedited way, and other colleges like ours not being able to do so. So looking to unify that. Lastly, with respect to the new oversight authority that Dan mentioned, some high-level questions there really for colleges. Questions about how RHPA colleges may be able to integrate with this new authority, because this authority exists in addition to RHPA colleges. And some questions around how should decisions be made about adding new professions or workers to this authority, subject to this authority. Right now, as Dan said, it is intended to regulate personal support workers, but it won't be limited to that. The vision is to add more professions or workers to that. So questions about how to do that. That's it in a nutshell. It's a very whirlwind approach, but my intention was just to serve as a memory aid to the materials you have. I'm going to now move through the draft response. And as Sandy and Dan alluded to, this is in draft. We're looking for your feedback and reactions. I'm going to go through each section in as brief a manner as I can so that we just reserve as much time as possible for you and your discussion. Before I get to core governance, I wanted to spend a minute just talking about the general positioning that we have proposed that the RCDSO take. We've positioned the RCDSO as really a support. The ministry's broader goals around transparency, accountability, building public trust are all things that this college has really been a supporter of and a leader in. So we've proposed that we come out in support of those broader goals, and importantly, position the RCDSO as a key partner. As Sandy said, it's always an option to remain silent on some elements. In this draft, you can see that we really have proposed commenting on everything so that the RCDSO can influence. This is a college that's respected and has influence with the ministry and other colleges. So we've put in some positions to really further that reputation and contribute. In relation to the two areas of significant change, governance and modernization, some of the general messaging that you will have seen in the draft is governance is really positioned as thoughts and ideas for what a good transition looks like. So that's how we've focused that. And then with respect to modernization, you will have seen both in the briefing note and throughout the draft, a lot of commentary around the twin pillars and concepts of right touch and red tape reduction. So that is another aspect that's woven through. So with respect to core governance, again, the strategy here was to focus on implementation. As Dan said, that was really done because these are concepts that we expect are moving forward. So the area that we believe the college can really have some influence is on how this happens, what this looks like in terms of transition. So in brief, the proposal to reduce counsel, we have proposed in the draft that there be a specific transition period and that it be 18 to 24 months in length. In other words, that there be an end point at which the smaller council needs to be in place and then allow colleges to sort of do that on their own time. We've proposed that in order to achieve the smaller side, council members be moved into some statutory committees, and that importantly, quorum requirements be amended so that we can continue the college's work throughout the transition. In terms of committee council separation, we've proposed that the same transition period that will be applied for council also be applied for the committee council separation. We've raised some questions about public member selection process for committees. It's unclear how that's going to take place, who will do that. And we've also proposed that the ministry allow colleges to retain current public members, again, to aid in transition. With respect to the composition of council, we've proposed to offer some comments around common competencies and how those should drive appointments, and a skills matrix, and you'll be familiar with that. With respect to term limits, we've not proposed a specific time period. Instead, we're proposing that we offer up the comment that limits need to be reasonable and that the importance of retaining institutional knowledge, and that there be a staggered appointment cycle. In terms of the selection of professional members, you will have seen in the proposal that the ministry is looking to move away from election of professional members and to an appointment model. They've asked about two aspects. Having a committee do that selection. And so we've offered some comments in the draft about what the committee might look like. We've proposed that it be statutory and be comprised of external members, much like our external review committee that we have in place at this college to assist with elections. We also propose the committee be appointed by colleges, not government. With respect to competencies, we offered support around various aspects of diversity, which obviously is a strong connection back to this council's work and interest in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the use of matrices. Lastly, in terms of the executive committee, the ministry's materials were framed very specifically. Their question on this aspect was, is there a public interest rationale to retain the executive committee? And that was really connected to the smaller council size. So with council being small, is there a public interest rationale to retain executive committee? And you can see in the draft, we've proposed that there isn't. There wasn't a specific public interest rationale to doing that. We have proposed to flag that ministry really think about, though, ensuring that council can be as nimble as our executive committee currently is. So propose that they really think about allowing for continued operations with vacancies and to give us flexibility in terms of quorum. And you can see in the draft really cited the important work that this executive committee has done for this college around the COVID-19 response, which was invaluable. Hanno, I'm going to pause there and turn it back to you for the discussion.
Thanks, Andrea. So at this point in time, we do have a period of time set aside for questions, either questions of clarification, comments you would like to make. I would ask that if someone prior to you has asked your question, when I call your name, please then just pass. I will be monitoring either the raised hand function or the chat. And I see that Richard is the first person to put his hand up. So when I call your name, please unmute yourself, ask your question, make your comment, and we will then continue to move through. So Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Hanno. I'd like to thank Dan and the whole college staff who really have worked hard on drafting this response. And with such a short timeline, you've obviously given this a lot of consideration. I question the ministry's objective of cutting red tape, especially in view of the fact that they want to add the Auditor General to oversee our finances, number one. Number two, have an ombudsman oversee any complaints through the discipline process. Does that actually cut red tape? It boggles my mind. Anyway, as chair of the working group, I'd like to just make some comments about the core governance. Particularly, I'm not sure that appointing professional members is really in the public interest. You know, in the symposium in 2020, we had a number of speakers, Australia, Ireland, and British Columbia. I thought Chris Hacker, who spoke on behalf of the college in BC, I didn't really see the similarity. The provincial government there had their hand forced. It was forced by the college not acting in the public interest, and morale was down. There were individual board members who behaved inappropriately. And the Caton report indicated that they only met 17 of 28 standards. I don't see that in our case. I think we're a far better regulator than BC ever was. So I question the similarity and the approach that, well, it's happened in BC, it's going to happen here. There's no doubt changes in the air, and it's going to be, well, it is upon us. And most of these items, I think, are really beneficial. I think that it streamlines and makes the college more efficient. At that symposium, 2 working groups made recommendations related to electing professional members. Judy Welakovich's group felt that the hybrid model of representation was preferred, providing it included competency evaluation prior to including a name on a ballot. The group also noted that contrary to BC, they felt there was a need for district representation to address regional disparities. Mark Trudell's group identified 4 principal benefits of the elected model: the ability to encourage candidates that have initiative, energy, and drive, ensure geographic representation, promote engagement with the profession, and provide for certain competencies on the board. The group also pointed out some negatives in the elected model, including elected members may not act in the public interest. They may be self-serving or see themselves as acting for a constituency rather than engaging in accountable regulation, and their election could be the result of a popularity contest. I don't know that we have any guarantees that appointments wouldn't be political in nature and that it would change an appointed member's perspective. The potential for political patronage is a real risk. Finding the real skill sets have been already addressed by having the constant competency review in advance of an election. Mark summarized the merit of the hybrid model, and I'm paraphrasing. The hybrid model holds the promise of providing the best of both worlds, elected and appointed. But again, whether it delivers on that promise it depends on the terms of reference for both elected and appointed members. Assuring competence of the council is key. So I think we've addressed the competency issue, and we have an independent review. I just want to state, in my humble opinion, I think we're better off with elected members, albeit even though we are downsizing the number of professional members. That's really all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening to my rant.
Thank you. Jack, did I see your hand go up?
Yes, it was. Thanks,
Okay.
Hanno. Good evening, everyone. And Richard, I agree. Thank you for the staff. Dan, Andre, and the staff has worked extremely hard getting this together. I know it's a very tight timeline, and that bothers me right there. It bothers all of us because you wonder if it's inevitable. You wonder that if the mind is already made up, and don't confuse me with the facts. How much deliberation does the government really want from us? I know I've been on council now over 3 years, and to the best of my knowledge, the RCDSO has been a model for regulatory health colleges across Canada and maybe across the world. We've been set up as an example. I know Irwin would say to us, and he would get acclaims from government, especially the health minister. We've been praised by many organizations. We are a role model. So what is the reason for the government reforms? Is it, that they say it's to enhance the efficacy of regulatory oversight and to build public trust and confidence in the regulatory sector. Well, for God's sakes, what am I missing here? If the reforms are intended to enhance transparency and accountability and to increase public confidence and trust, what have we been doing? I mean, have we not been doing this? I think we've been doing it extremely well. Look at the CPMF, the latest one. We got great ratings. We failed, or at least we were slow in some areas, for instance, complaints, but we're making good inroads to correct that. We have competencies. We're one of the first colleges to bring on competencies and a hybrid election. And Richard, I totally agree with your hybrid elections that we talked about, or you talked about. We've been improving our delivery systems, thanks to Dan and, his approach. Again, the whole approach of right touch and red tape reduction. We've been enhancing this. We've been a leader. We're not the BC Dental College where, Caton had to come in. Fiscal audits, well, Jeffrey, you know it. We are on top of things. We are fiscally sound. We've always been fiscally sound, and we've been very transparent. So what are we missing here? Where are we failing? As a college, we're not failing at all. That's the way I look at things. And until shown otherwise, we are an excellent example of what a health regulatory body should be. But the government wants to take us down this path of reform for whatever reason. Maybe there's some bad players, and I know there are some, but we're not a bad player. Sounds like they've made up their mind. I think it's questionable whether we should answer the questions, and I agree with what Andrea said. To be mute is probably shooting ourselves in the foot, and so we have to answer it. But I think before we do, we should strongly suggest to amend the response by adding a paragraph or two about what we've been doing as a college, how proud we are, and how we should be set up as an example, and the government should use what we've done to set examples, including elected members. And I think that's important, because when I look at the draft response, there's no praise. There's nothing about our college doing a great job, and I think that's lacking. So I think before we do what the government wants, and it's like a dog and pony show in a sort, we should at least tell the world, put it on paper, how good we are and what a good job we've done. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have a speakers list. I would also just like to ask either Dan, Andrea, or Sandy, if there are times that you feel you can jump in for a little bit of clarification, please do so. Next on the list of speakers is David.
Is that me, David Mock?
David Mock, sorry, yes.
There's a few of us here. Okay, thank you. And I will be brief. First of all, I actually like the response by and large. And one of the things I like about it is a lack of too much specificity. I think, that old phrase, the devil's in the details. I think whether we like it or not, these are the directions we're going to be moving. It just seems to be what's happening everywhere. If we're moving in this direction, and I don't know that this has to be in the response, but I want to bring it up and hear what Dan and Andrea and others may say about it. I think we have to redefine what we've called competencies, and to include, because first of all, we need competencies for the selection committee. And the selection committee has to be appropriately diverse. Competencies, by the way, I'll define what I mean by diverse in a moment. Competencies for the appointed people has to include, as I think Richard alluded to, more than just the personal competency, but with a large council, we had people coming from various regions that have very different concerns. And I think in a province like Ontario, some degree of regional representation should be one of the criteria that is included under competencies when selecting appointees. Similarly, we have quite a diversity of experiences, fields of interest, fields of practice. Right now on council, we all bring something to council meetings when discussing major policy changes. I think we have to redefine the competencies to include or to ensure that we have this kind of diversity in this very small council with what is a half a dozen professionals. And I would go so far, we should have similar diversity amongst the public appointees. I don't know that this has to go into this document. It's the details that have to come afterwards, but I want to drop this into there so that it doesn't get ruled out by any further government intervention. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Judy? Judy, you're muted.
So often I'm not. Yes, I would also like to thank everybody for this hard work. It's very clear that this very short timeline is the government style. So I guess we're now having to deal with it. I had one thing to say and then one thing to ask. I think one thing to ask. I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made, particularly around there's the things that Richard and Jack talked about. I agree with what David is saying, but I also think that we need to be a little more targeted, I think, in terms of what our objective is. I mean, for one thing, I think that given the size of the profession and given the size of the province, I honestly think that diluting the council to 6 members, professional members, is really not in the public interest. I think it is in the public interest to have more people representing more regions across the province. I think that's a big problem. I also I have many things to say, but I'm just going to limit myself here. I'm just going to go back to my document. I'm trying to understand why public members would not be able to sit on statutory committees. And if that's the case, shouldn't we oppose that? Because I mean, and I know this is a let's work together kind of document, but I mean, when you take away the public members, or if you take away professional members from either any of the committees or from the council itself, aren't you losing the balance that having both sets of the groups there is supposed to bring? I don't know. To me, it's not in the public interest to have a statutory committee that's comprised only of professional members. I think that public members serve as a perceived check on the interests of the professional members, and shouldn't we be concerned about that?
Judy, I'm just going to quickly throw that to Andrea, because I think she's going to be able to answer that question for you.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Judy. My understanding of the proposal is it's not that they don't want public members on statutory committees. What they're proposing is that the membership of council be separate from the membership of committees. So there is a bright line between those two. So not that committees won't have public members, but just they won't have council members, either professional or public council members. So there'd be a separate public pool for committees and a separate professional pool for committees, as opposed to council.
Okay. There's so much lack of real detail in this so-called appointments and selections processes that it's really hard to comment in any meaningful way. But thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Jamie, I've got you next.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and council, good evening, and staff, good evening. No doubt it's been mentioned, I'll mention it again. This is a lot of hard work, and thank you for getting these documents in front of us with some information, but not enough information. So I second everybody's thoughts that this is quite a brief submission. Referring to a comment that Richard made, I think a hybrid approach to professional members is really a good thing. And I say that because I haven't had a lot of interaction with everybody due to obviously COVID, but I can tell you that any interaction I've had with the members, and it's only been through the ICRC, has been absolutely terrific. And I sit there and I listen to their expertise, and I understand so much more about the issues. And I think these members have put their hand up in an election forum because they are committed and they're very interested. Where I have some concerns is and I've worked in an SRO where there were appointments. And I think, Dr. Hunter, you mentioned that there could be patronage, and I've seen that happen. And it's been very frustrating for those people who are on, committees, any committee, basically, where there's someone that has been appointed and there really isn't that level of, I would say, qualification to be part of a committee. So I think this is an area that they're going to have to tread very carefully. And I did a little bit of research with some of the members, and I know some of the elections were actually acclaimed, and I think that's because maybe people don't know how important it is to put your hand up to be elected. So let's just call the hybrid model, I think, something that should be investigated a little bit further. I understand judges in Ontario get appointed through, committees, a selection committee of lay people as well as people appointed by the Attorney General. I think that's working okay. So I see where it's going in our environment, but I'm just not sure that the selection process has been outlined in enough detail for us to really be supportive of that. And that's all I really have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mark Eckler, you're next.
Thank you very much. Once again, to everyone for putting in all the time and hard work. Personally, I seem to support a fair bit of this. Downsizing the council to what number, I'm not sure. I fully appreciate Judy's comments and, is 5 professional members and 5 public members too few to represent the province, but downsizing of some sort. And definitely support equality between public and professional members. Further to many comments was what problem is trying to be solved by doing away with an elected model or a hybrid model and going to a fully appointed. I don't know if Dan or Andre or Sandy can comment on that because initial gut is to support what Jamie and Richard and others have said.
Thank you. Amelia, you're next, please.
Good evening. I agree with what Mark's saying, but I'll make it brief. The dental community is a small community. It's important to have continued feedback and engagement from our district members. Dentists email, text, call me on a regular basis to discuss many issues. I don't believe this will continue as well with the new suggested model. Therefore, I don't believe that the suggested changes are necessary. So, thank you.
Thank you. Ben?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I also would like to echo the comments made by Richard, Jack, Jamie, Mark, Amelia, about having reservations about switching to an appointed model. Again, I would like to remind Council that we had a symposium on governance in March of 2020, as Richard had said. And at that symposium, which Council attended, along with a number of guests, they reaffirmed our hybrid elected model with some suggestions and improvements. I am a big believer in democratic principles. I think democracy gives us a mandate. I believe we should look at we should look at this issue through the lens of both the RCDSO strategic plan as well as the ministry goals. Both of them are aligned in that they want accountability, they want transparency, they want diversity and inclusion, and they want to build engagement. And in my opinion, the elected model does that, accomplishes all those goals. And I have questions and concerns about the appointed model. For accountability, elected members have a 2-year term, and if they're not doing a good job, they're elected out. For an appointed model, I'm not sure how that would work. For transparency, during an elected model, we have candidates, they present themselves, they put forth position papers. So everybody knows where they lie on certain issues. So it's a very transparent process. In an appointed model, I'm not sure how that's going to work. Regarding diversity and inclusion, in an elected model, we have built-in geographical diversity. So my biggest fear is that if we go to a smaller council size, that it will be populated by a lot of GTA members. And then where does Northern Ontario or Eastern Ontario or Western Ontario come in? Finally, you will lose engagement with the profession. I mean, with the elected model, you have people stepping forward, people who are interested, like I said before, people with energy and passion. So I have to say that I am in support of our current hybrid model. I have severe reservations about the appointed model. And one other thing I would like council to consider is that if council were to be downsized, and let's say we're downsized to 5 or 6 members, professional members, we also have to keep in mind that there is the possibility that in the future, the 4 dental colleges will be amalgamated. So when that occurs and we have a council of only 5 or 6, then I would think that one would have to be a dentist, one would have to be a hygienist, one would have to be a dental technologist, and one would have to be a denturist. So a small council might not be effective in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Dan, I see your hand up. I'm happy to add you to the list, but I didn't know if your hand was up to address what Ben just said.
So I'll go in order, Hanno. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So next on my list is Joseph.
Thank you, Hanno, and just thank you for these for the draft response. It was very well put together. I just have a couple of comments. Number one, with respect to the transition period, I would perhaps recommend that we adjust that to at least 24 months. I feel that, transition may, takes time, especially if you're talking about amending bylaws and dealing with various different changes that will be happening. I think that we should be putting forward a lengthier time, even if we end up only getting 18 months, that we shouldn't go on the low end of the 18 months. We should request 24 months at the very least. With respect to, I agree with what Jack has said with respect to lauding some of the benefits. What I am suspecting is that these changes are being brought forward based on all colleges, not because of our RCDSO is doing anything wrong, but it's based on, an average of what they're observing in colleges. So I think it is worthwhile to put a paragraph or two about what the benefits of our model of governance, because I believe we have been a model for good governance in all respects. And I think that could be included in the introduction. And thirdly, just comments about the public member or the public member recommendations. It doesn't seem to be very clear, going to what Judy said earlier, from their document, from the minister's document, whether they actually anticipate public members being a part of statutory committees. It's not clear in their document. I appreciate what Andrea said, but it's not clear. They only refer to public members as in the context of council and then the selection process. And I highly doubt that the government is going towards a model where they're going to start making public member appointments for each and every statutory committee of each health regulatory body. I don't know why they would make that would complexify, if that's perhaps not a word, but that would complicate their task in the appointment process, which is very long and arduous. I highly doubt that that's their intention. So I think that there should be perhaps more, I don't know if it's a request for clarification on that. And I do think that for public members, I won't speak for professional members, but for public members, I think there is value to having a public member as both council member and as a statutory committee member. And I think that's something that we could consider mentioning expressly, that at least for public members, I don't see the same concerns that could perhaps be there for professional members. I don't see that for public members sitting on both. And in fact, I think it quite enhances our knowledge of the college and the structures and the processes and the procedures to be both part of statutory committees as well as council. So those are my three remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter? Peter, you're muted.
Here we go. So I have a couple of comments I want to make after reading the reply. We were talking earlier about diversity and geographic diversity. Obviously, someone like myself I would probably not be on that committee or on that council if there was no geographic diversity. I hope, certainly my hope is with appointments and stuff, is that the council doesn't become a GTA-centric kind of a place where, most of the people there are within 30 miles of the college, and maybe well-known, attached to the university, brilliant people, but, they'll be bringing absolutely the same interests into discussion. So I'm hoping that there's a little bit of geographic diversity along the way. Second comment I wanted to make, and I don't know if this is an appropriate time to make it, was just about there were 3 pages about incorporating the French Services Act at the college. And when I read the response from the college, all I could think of was Paul Simon's song, there must be 50 ways. And that kind of came to mind. In this case, I thought, God, there got to be 50 ways to get out of providing French service at the college. And I'm thinking, it's unacceptable that in this day and age, we sit here debating the merits of an organization like this one being able to provide services to the public of Ontario in French. Our reply to the government should be simple and concise, and it should be, we'd be happy to work with an agency to develop ways to deliver French services to a standard that meets or exceeds the Ontario French Services Act. And perhaps we could even put that in the strategic plan. Last thing that's of interest here for me was the compensation disclosure. And compensation disclosure is an important part of the Oversight Authority plan and not only in that Oversight Authority, but also in the PSA, the Harry Caton playbook as well. So boards and public, whether they be public or private, disclose income paid to members of those boards. And I was thinking, I know that there's a bit of an issue with public members getting paid a certain thing and professional members getting paid a certain thing. And I'm wondering, why are we not showing the differences between what public and professional board members get paid so that we can hopefully bring about a little equity in the board member pay scale? We need to disclose, discuss, and amend. And I think that would go a long way to helping things around the table. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Dan, you're next.
Thanks, Hanno. And I see a couple of others, so I'll be brief. I want to just provide a little bit of commentary based on several of the comments, and it's been great in hearing some of the different ways in which you want to approach this. I think going back to the issue of what's the problem, and I think it was Joseph who hit on it. This is not an RCDSO issue exclusively. This is 26 health profession colleges and other sectors. I think you can expect, in terms of being on council and what can be expected by other regulatory bodies, there's going to be a lot taken from the model that's been developed for the Ontario College of Teachers. It's a model that has done almost exactly in the education sector what is being discussed and has been brought forward by the government. It has a smaller board. It has appointments. It has a selection committee. In legislation, it talks to competencies that are required on the board. It talks to diversity. It says that there is a requirement for at least one Francophone on the board and at least one member of an Indigenous community. So it's approached it in that way. And I think there are ways to, I think the term, excuse me, the term used was to depoliticize it. There are some ways to structure it. And I'm not an expert on the College of Teachers. It is a very new model, but that is something that is occurring in Ontario with a different sector and something that we would obviously want to learn from if this is the path that we're going down. Again, with respect to the problem, I think it has been a trail of issues over 2 decades, probably more, where there has been a real and perceived bias in terms of individuals who are elected and perceived to be representing the profession versus bringing their fiduciary duty to the council. And, we can argue the merits of that, probably all night. But that has certainly been a real concern that's been brought forward in a number of examples and cases in Ontario and elsewhere. And it does create real confusion. It creates confusion for the profession who elect the members. Who are you representing? And I know, but I don't think this profession or many other professions really understand that. And it creates confusion for the public. So there's a number of aspects to this that go beyond RCDSO and what you've described as some of the concerns that you have in taking a good model and going to something that's unknown. And my final comment is, I don't want to lose sight of the bigger objective here as well. I want to make sure that, I'm reading the tea leaves, and in my mind, this is happening. And I want to make sure that we, RCDSO, are still able to have a great deal of influence with the government in terms of how it happens. And so I don't want to, come out with a response that opposes. We have to be more political than that. And we have to be able to engage and continue to build our relationship with government so that we can have an incredible amount of input into how this is going to work. If, as I believe, and I think many others in the regulatory community believe, that this is inevitable. So I don't want you, council, to lose sight of that bigger objective. We'll certainly massage this and make changes as you direct, but keep in mind the objective.
Thanks, Dan. Part of my role is also to monitor time. So having said that, I have 4 people on my list still. I'm going to go to you 4. I'm cutting the list off now, and I'm going to ask the next 4 people to really keep their comments or questions to less than a minute, because we are also cognizant of wanting to end this meeting properly as well by 8 o'clock, as well as giving you an opportunity to speak. So Rod, I'm going to you next, please.
Thank you. I'm coming on the back end of many comments. I'm going to try and net this out because much has been covered already. Dan, we are going back with a document that very carefully, and I think fairly astutely and politically, describes how we'll do this with some moderated changes, mostly in transitional time and approaches. But I agree with you. There's a larger train on the track here, and I'm wondering, is it wise to go back solely as one regulatory body, given what other trains are coming down the track? And if, for example, you knew that right behind the heels or on the heels of this, they were going to come down and as Ben suggested, combine regulatory colleges with the hygienists, the denturists, and orthodontists. One question is, would our response change in any way if we knew that was coming? In fact, we probably do know it's coming. So you don't have to answer that now, but that'd be one interest of mine. Secondly, is there any benefit, especially given your prior history with the CPSO, in comparing responses with another large regulatory agency to see how they're approaching this, to see if we can galvanize or combine political activities and maybe in our favor? I'm not sure if that's a benefit at all, but I thought that it might be, given that we've been asked just to acquiesce to the how of this. I look at some of the other comments. I generally can't disagree with the direction of where they're trying to get rid of bias and they're trying to do separation of duties, and they're very, very focused on transparency. One suggestion may be, and I recognize what the board of council is saying on, there is worries about the elective model. There is worries about the appointment model. I am a product of the appointment model. I know full well what the bias, basically political patronage bias of the appointment model is today. If we are going to acquiesce to a future appointment model, then perhaps it behooves us to demand of the government who are overseeing us the same degree of transparency that they expect us to put in place, and that make it a competency-based model rather than to avoid political patronage. So I think that's fair if it go in two streets, because they can quickly abuse it. In fact, have abused it many times in the past. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jack, you're next, but I'm going to ask you to please keep it under a minute.
I will, and thank you so much. I just want to reemphasize what Ben and Rod said, because I had talked to Ben about this, and this is the long-term goal, is to amalgamate at least 4 colleges, the technicians, the denturists, the hygienists, and ourselves in BC. The assistants are also involved. That may be long-term here. We were self-regulated way back when I graduated. Then we became, if it's even number on the board, 5 and 5 or 6 and 6, we'll be even. And that's not, I don't have a problem with reducing the board or what was council, but I do have a problem being watered down to 1 or 2 representatives when an equal vote is, for instance, dental technicians or dental hygienists. And we have to make sure that we're represented, whatever the number is, 5 or 6, as registrants of the RCDSO, and not of the board that's amalgamated with the other smaller, lesser faculties, health regulatory bodies. That's the first thing. Second thing is, where does the PLP sit with this? How do we control PLP, especially once we're amalgamated with the others? Is PLP left out of the equation? Have we given any thought to the future? That's my 2 comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard? Richard, you're muted.
Dan, did you want to answer Jack? I saw you were ready to, so.
Yeah, quick, and to Jack and others, there is nothing in what we have seen or heard, and to the direct question to the ministry posed about amalgamation, that is not part of this series of changes that are happening. So will it happen down the road long term? Who knows? Possibly, but it's not part of these changes. I just wanted to be clear on that.
Okay, my question is really to either Dan or Andrea, and it's just the response of the CPSO. I think it was 2019 or 2020. I saw a document that said they supported changes, a number of changes similar to what these proposed changes are, but they did want an elected model. They reduced the size of council. Is that still on the table for them?
Andrea or Dan, who would like to take that?
Andrea, do you want to? take
You
that?
know, to be honest, I'm not sure. I know that our submission, just to respond to somebody else's question, our submission is largely aligned with the CPSO in terms of a lot of the modernization elements and some of the implementation. I don't recall, Richard, exactly where their vision is, CPSO's vision, in terms of that specific issue. I don't have it at my fingertips. I don't know, Dan, if you do.
I don't have that at my fingertips. I know that the nurses are definitely along the lines of an appointed model. And I believe the naturopaths and I believe the pharmacists, but I don't, again, have that as at my fingertips. And I also just want to say that we work closely with all 25 other colleges. And there is a common response going from our federation, and it will focus solely on the third-party modernization oversight that you'll talk about in a minute. And it really, because there was more commonality and with the timeframes that we had, we could come together with one response that would be representative of all colleges. And that's certainly reflected in the document you have tonight. And we would have a much greater challenge to pull together 26 colleges who would have any sort of agreement around the governance reforms or how we wanted to implement it. So, and they're all nuanced because everyone has their own different bylaws and they'll have their own different versions of how to implement it. So that's the reason why it hasn't focused on the front end of the document.
Okay, Richard?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
the
you.
last document that came, the College of Physicians wanted an elected model that came to governance.
Okay, thank you. So I've got Nalin and Nancy on my list, and I'm going to give each of you now less than a minute because we are running late and we do want to get through all of this to give you an opportunity to address all of these issues. So Nalin, less than a minute, then Nancy.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick. First, I want to acknowledge the work that the staff has done. I think this is an excellent first stab at the proposed changes. But again, first stab. And it's quite possible that the mood in this province has changed as of late, as we've witnessed all around everyone's streets. And in the end, that the population is the ultimate authority, even above the government. So a couple things. You know, there may have been problems in the past, but by changing them doesn't mean you don't have problems in the future. So we need to make sure we put in place with the government's help good policy. And good policy means adopting best practices, having good data to back it up, good research, and meetings with stakeholders, of which we've done none. And then also to communicate that new policy effectively to the population, to our stakeholders. And it seems if you just ram this through, you haven't done. You haven't made good policy, you haven't partaken in good communication. And really, that's a mockery of transparency. And you know what? I think in the new Ontario, that's what forces people to stand in the freezing cold on a bridge. So let's make sure we don't go down that road.
Thanks. Nancy. Nancy, you have to unmute.
My apologies, sorry about that. I just want to briefly state that I commend the college staff on this very well drafted first response. I see this as an excellent opportunity for the college in collaborating with the government and the other colleges to influence and shape governance reform. It's going to happen and we just have to make it work. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all. This has been great discussion, comments, and questions. I know that Dan, Andrea, and Sandy and staff will take the information that they have gathered when they move to the next section. And I'm going to turn it back over to you now, Andrea, and you're going to deal with section number 2, modernization.
That's right. Yes, thank you. Just bear with me
Hanno,
1 second. Counsel.
Yes.
Alan Bromstein has his hand up while Andrea is finding her slide.
Okay, sorry, Alan.
Sorry, I just quickly looked at e-dialogue, which I believe is a document published by the CPSO. And it indicates, it was June 2021, it says, Council supported pursuing a competency-based appointment process for all members of the board. This approach is considered a best practice as it supports the right mix of knowledge, skills, and experience amongst board members to ensure it can effectively discharge its function. It goes on to say that in 2018, Council indicated a preferred hybrid model. However, since 2018, there's been a growing consensus outside of the college on the value of competency-based appointments. So it appears that its council is supporting competency-based appointments.
Thank you, Alan. And I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move quickly as I can. So in this section, I know some of you have already commented on the modernization elements, but in the draft response, the strategy that we've proposed for this section is to focus on both the concepts, so the types of changes with respect to modernization that the ministry is proposing, as well as some implementation sections. And that's really just because these are, unlike the governance changes that we've been discussing, you've been discussing, these modernization, this 3 additional levels of oversight are newer concepts. So that's the strategy. In terms of housekeeping, you'll see that the draft proposes that we support the changes. There's one addition that to the updated terminology that we're suggesting they consider updating college, because that is a word that is often confusing to many. And then with respect to modernization, you will see in some of the introductory comments the support for the ministry's goals, indication that more dialogue is required, and then as we've been talking about, these notions of right touch approach and red tape reduction. Just to work through those proposed modernization elements, with respect to French language, you see in the draft an alternative proposal that's been put into place. Under the RHPA currently, colleges have obligations to provide services in French. Those have been implemented to varying degrees across the sector. So an alternate proposal that is included in the draft is that the ministry use those provisions as an anchor point, focus on implementation, setting benchmarks and so on, and then driving compliance through the CPMF. And then if based on that data change is needed further, to then move to the French Language Services Act. So that's a proposed approach. And then the draft goes on to talk through some of the implications that we can spot with respect to making the colleges subject to the FLSA. I won't go through this in great detail. You have the snippets here on the screen. In the interest of time, I'll just move on to the Auditor General. The strategy in this section is to really focus on, and I think some of you touched on this already, extensive oversight that's already in place, not only with finances, but with other aspects of college operations. Both of those elements were put into the draft simply because the Auditor General has quite a broad mandate, both for financial audits and value for money audits. So it raises the question about, there's existing oversight already that's extensive, raising a question about why additional oversight is needed. And then if oversight is needed, making the point that the Auditor General is not suitable. And largely that's because colleges do not receive public funds. As all of you know, colleges are funded through registrant dues, which is a real departure from the Auditor General's mandate, which focuses specifically on publicly funded institutions and agencies. Moving to the complaints and discipline oversight, very similar tact proposed to the Auditor General, outlining first the extensive oversight that already exists with respect to decision-making processes, focusing on the negative implications of adding more, because again, as a reminder, this is about adding additional oversight, not taking away any of the current oversight. And then making the argument that even if more oversight is needed, the patient ombudsman is not suitable. And there's a variety of points expressed there. Just as a quick recap, this is sort of, you will have seen this underpinning the modernization section. And, our understanding is, as Dan noted, all of the health regulatory colleges are doing a joint response, and most of them are doing an individual response. And these are some common themes, certainly in our draft submission, as well as those others. Uncertainty why, additional oversight's needed, not sure what the problem is we're solving. The notion that this is going to have a significant drain on colleges' resources, both finances and staff, to the point that from a red tape reduction perspective, concern that it may compromise our ability to get to our core business And then additionally, the potential for overlap and conflicting direction. As you're adding in entities that have jurisdiction that can overlap, the worry is that for a single issue, you may have the college trying to respond to various oversight bodies that have different perspectives and may provide different direction. So I'll pause there, Hanno, and turn it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Andrea. So this is an opportunity to either ask a question or express a comment. We already had one opinion expressed in our last section around the French Language Services Act, which I think was valuable and fits into this category. Anyone else have a question or comment that they would like to make about the area of modernization? David Mock.
I will do this very quickly. I like this section, actually, including the more detailed explanations, and I'm particularly pleased with the rejection of the patient ombudsman's involvement. I think this actually takes away neutrality, or even the appearance of neutrality. I think it's an excellent, this is very well written, and I personally would support all of it.
Thanks, David. Peter.
Yeah, just a quick comment. If we were to liquidate everything the college owned tomorrow, how much of that goes back to the dentists? And as I understand it, absolutely zero. And so I'll make the argument that every bit of money that goes into our accounts is public money. Thanks.
Judy.
Yes, thank you. I'm not really sure where Peter Deline was going with that. I mean, it's to me, it seems as if, you know, everything that would be in those accounts is tax, basically, if it went back to the public purse. But I did want to make the point that while you say that colleges don't receive, or the RCDSO anyway, doesn't receive public funds, that the public members who sit on the council and committees are paid by the public purse. Not much, but we are paid by the public purse. So I think that you need to take that into account. In this section, I thought it was interesting that there's more pushback than there was in the section before. And I think a lot of us that on this council and a lot of people who've spoken tonight think there needs to be some more pushback on the first section. And as I said, I support the pushback in this one, but I think we need to look at section 1 also.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Nancy.
I too am in agreement with Dr. Mock. I feel that it was very well detailed, this section, outlining all of the oversights. And I totally am in support and agreement as to our response. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have no one else on my list. Oh, Dan.
I just want to respond to what Judy said in terms of pushback, and just to draw a distinction between the two. The first section that we just spent our time on, as I've discussed and many others discussed, has been widely discussed in many jurisdictions for many years, and seems inevitable, is inevitable in Ontario, because we're seeing it with the College of Teachers. The second section that we are on right now is somewhat brand new. No one saw it coming. No one saw that. No one has ever talked, to my knowledge, about the Auditor General or the Patient Ombudsman. There has been some discussion within the last year or so about the French Language Services Act, but those other two were, I would say, a big surprise when we opened the document and saw it.
I'm not really sure how that limit, because you seem to be saying that gives you more freedom with the second section.
I was only trying to draw the distinction in terms of why we took the approach that we did, and why the federation, or what's called HPRO, of all the health regulatory colleges are taking a similar approach with this section on modernization. I'm not suggesting that you do one thing or the other, but that's why we drew that line between how we approached strategically each of these two sections.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that clarification, Dan. Nalan.
Yeah, just a quick question for maybe Dan or Andrea. Like, looking at the complexity of this document, it's pretty complex. There's a lot of things to answer there, and there's a short turnaround time, just what I believe 4 weeks. Is this normal or abnormal in your past dealings with the ministry?
Normal.
Somewhat normal.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of ways to interpret this, and I think one interpretation can be that we're going to see some potentially some fairly quick results from this in terms of legislation. I don't know whether that is true or not, but I think that's one outcome that could reasonably be considered. So, Nalan, we have had a number of circumstances in the regulatory sector where things are often very fast like this.
I could maybe just add, Nalan, to your question. What seems to be a trend with government in terms of running consultations is that they will do a sort of what I'm going to call a conceptual consultation, like what we have in front of us. So no legislation, ideas, concepts, that type of thing. That seems to be something we're seeing more often these days. And so that aspect will be quite typically fairly short, although this is quite short, and it's very like disparate elements and as you say, quite dense and complicated. But the notion that they consult on concepts and ideas and then come back with legislation after that is something we're seeing more frequently. So it seems to be in keeping with their process these days.
Thank you.
Thank you again, all. And Andrea, I'm going to turn it back over to you. And I believe, oh, Dan,
Yes.
was your hand up, or you just hadn't taken? Okay, thank you.
No.
Turning it back over to you, Andrea, to talk about the section on registration, please.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see here. Let's see if this will. Yes, great. Okay, registration practices. In this aspect of the draft, you probably picked up, Counsel, that many of the requirements or ideas really focus on removing barriers to registration. So with respect to Canadian experience, you see in the draft some comment from us that Canadian experience is not an initial requirement, for initial licensure, but we do have it connected to a requirement for currency of licensure. The proposed approach here is that we express openness to removing a Canadian experience requirement, but that we state there needs to be a mechanism to ensure currency is required, that is really connected to our mandate. So that's that aspect. There was some questions in the ministry's materials about internationally trained graduates and some barriers. We have included in the draft acknowledgement that we are aware of some barriers that exist. We understand that those are principally, in our experience, flowing from third-party processes or organizations. That those of you involved in registration matters will know. Quite typically, year over year since 2015, which is the first year we started to track this, we consistently register more internationally trained graduates than we do domestically trained, and we have noted that. In terms of time limits, the proposal to impose time limits on decisions, we've included in there the time limits that we currently work with, which I think are quite good, between 2 and 4 weeks. We've expressed openness to some time limits, but again, have proposed some specific conditions that are really aimed at making sure any time limits imposed really get at the committee's deliberation, that we're not going to be subject to a time limit that is out of our control. For example, if an applicant is still gathering documents, we don't want the clock to start running then. We want the clock to start running when we have something completed. And so therefore, we're just getting judged on our work. So that's included. Lastly, well, penultimate one, language proficiency, proposing that we express openness to a standardized approach across the sector, with the provision that the approach is flexible and evergreen. Our registration committee has done some really good work over the last couple of years to develop a policy that allows for a lot of flexibility and allows us to keep that document current to reflect changes in the environment and best practices. So advocating for that. With respect to the last item in this section, expedited registration in emergencies, again, no secrets where this is coming from. The draft proposes or suggests that, it certainly makes sense to give colleges flexibility to expedite registration to respond to emergencies. It does go on to flag for the government a few different factors to be thinking about. In the dental landscape, many of you will know, the regulators across the country have some documents where we have a set sort of criteria or requirements for licensure, so that, in other words, Ontario is not an island unto itself. We sit in a broader context nationally, and wanting to flag that for the government. Flagging a potential fairness issue. Graduates from non-accredited institutions are subject to an equivalency process for the NDAB, so asking some questions about, will those individuals get access to this expedited registration, or how will that work? And then importantly, putting some content in about how can we ensure public safety is not compromised. So if we're going to expedite licensure for an individual to respond to an emergency, what are those safety mechanisms we want to have in place? Because this individual, by definition, hasn't met all of the standard registration requirements. And then post-emergency, as we're transitioning this individual back, wanting to make sure we can have that individual go through any remaining requirements that are in place. So again, striking a balance between being responsive to emergencies, but also maintaining public safety. So again, I'll pause here, Hannah.
Thanks, Andrea. Any questions or comments on this section? Richard. Richard, you need to unmute, please.
Thank you, Hannah. Sorry, everybody. The Canadian experience, Andrea, what exactly is that? Was it service in remote areas or something, or?
I think Richard, what I think that they're getting at, and this is again very consistent with what we're seeing from the Ontario Fairness Commissioner, so there's a lot of alignment. They seem to be getting at wanting to remove a barrier for international graduates. So my understanding is across the sector, some colleges have a requirement that prior to licensure, individuals have experience in Canada. And they're perceiving that as a barrier for the internationally trained grad that may come directly from the jurisdiction in which they're trained and want to be licensed. And so it's a way of looking at how can we remove unneeded barriers to the path to licensure.
And have we ever had those barriers in Ontario?
To the best of my knowledge, there's others around the table that are probably more experienced in this than I am, but to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe so. I think the way that we framed the response, Richard, is that it's not a requirement for the RCDSO for initial licensure. Where the Canadian experience comes in is if there's a period of more than 3 years that's elapsed since the person was certified by the NDEB, we ask that there be experience in either Canada or the US. And then the registration committee has actually expanded that to any jurisdiction in with which we have a reciprocal agreement. So there's an expanded group. So it's not limited to Canadian, and it's tied to currency and continuous practice. But I'll let others weigh in if I've messed any of that up. Someone will correct me, I'm sure.
Thank you. Now, Alan, are you responding to this, or you just want to be on the list?
I'm just responding.
Perfect. Go ahead then, please.
I don't think, Richard, that this is an issue for the RCDSO. This is an issue at other colleges that they're trying to address through this global response.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
Alan. Harinder?
Thank you, Hannah. Just want to add, if you look at Fairness Commissioner's report over the last few years on this matter, I think they have given us a good score on that we are doing a good job on registration. So I don't think this is something to be worried about for us. And Andrea, you have done a great job in this section. Thank you.
Thank you. David Mock?
I will be very brief. I worked on the original proposals for foreign trained graduates, and we worked with the foreign commissioner at the time, who I knew personally. So we actually worked quite closely. They have always been basically satisfied with the way we're dealing with it. The issue has not been Canadian experience. One of the issues that we've often had is accredited versus not accredited programs, because internationally, not everybody accredits programs. And that's one that we've always had to deal with, but I think we've actually dealt with it quite well.
Thank you. And I have no one left on my speakers list. I don't see anyone in the chat. So thank you, Counsel, very much for your input in this section. And now, Andrea, I'm turning it over to you again for the final section.
Okay, terrific. We're in the home stretch. Okay. So the remaining section is very high level. And again, this was some questions government was asking colleges about the newly formed Oversight Authority. And this authority was just formed in 2021. To my last check, I checked a couple of weeks ago, there's not even a board of directors established yet. It's still in its infancy. The government has asked some questions of us. What is in the draft response is very high level, as you will have seen, an openness to information sharing and support around best practices. The specific question the government had about how it should proceed to decide what professions or workers fit under this authority. The draft suggests that they develop criteria. Those of you who've been in regulation for a while may remember the Health Professions Regulatory Advisory Council, HPRAC. It's now defunct, but HPRAC used to answer some of these questions, and they had quite developed criteria to guide that decision making. And so the draft just alludes to that and indicates that that would be a transparent and objective way to make those decisions. Obviously not getting into detail what that criteria should look like, but just advocating for that approach. That's really it in a nutshell. Hannah, I'll let you sort of respond to questions, but just as a reminder, this is the question before council. We've been taking notes on all your comments. And we'll obviously, as Dan mentioned, we are going to work closely with the executive committee to incorporate your comments and feedback and finalize the draft. But this is the question and direction we're looking for from you. So Hannah, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. I would just also like to take a moment to thank staff, to thank Dan, Andrea, and Sandy for all the information that you have provided for us and for allowing this conversation to go on. And I would like to thank Counsel for the input and the care and consideration you've taken in not only reviewing this document, but in asking the questions that you've needed to have clarified and expressing your comments. So you did see what the motion that we will be addressing is. We have 11 minutes before we need to actually do that. So if you have, I see your hand is up, Dan, but I'm also going to allow people, if you have questions that have come up now, if you still require some other kind of clarification, we will take actually the next 10 minutes to address that. And at 7:55 at the latest, I would ask to have the motion back up on the screen, and we will consider that motion and vote on it. So Dan, I've got you first, and then I've got Peter.
Thanks, Hannah. And I just wanted to try to make sure that we've framed a lot of really good comments and how we actually take that back and formulate the final version. It seems to me that the latter three sections, modernization, registration, and that related to the oversight body, there was pretty solid agreement in terms of using the content that you've seen and the tone that was established. I think with respect to governance, there's a couple of things, and I'll float these and I really want to hear your response, because we want to know how to put this together, and obviously we'll be working with the exec as has been said. I heard a lot about principles. There was a lot, and we've emphasized some, but we'll go back and make sure that we're emphasizing them enough. Principles around competency-based. There have to be competency-based boards. I think that's what the whole exercise has been in Ontario with many of the other colleges. Good practices that relate to things like stakeholder engagement. I really take Nalan's comments to heart in terms of no matter what this looks like, you have to have the not you, but we have to have the profession involved in regulation, because they play such an important role, as does the public. And we want to make sure that whether it's a legislative solution or whether it's more of an individual counsel and activity-based solution, we want to make sure that that's a big part of this. A number of goals, and I think, Ben, you talked about them, but the goals that we have in our strat plan that I think are very important for anything that is a result of this whole work: accountability, transparency, diversity, engagement. All of those, we want to make sure that we've adequately addressed those in the document. Coming back to, lots of comments about, do we oppose, do we support, are we neutral? One way we could approach this is to provide some commentary on the hybrid model. Not an extensive review, but we could provide some introduction to that as part of this letter. I'm not suggesting, or I don't want you to have expectations that that will be taken up. I think we should keep our expectations low to zero on that. But we could certainly provide a little bit more input into different models that might be available and have they been thought about. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that we oppose no elections, but that is up to you. So those are my thoughts, just to help us to frame all of the changes that we will make as a result of today. And there's been many others that have been focused on specific parts like transition period and so on. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Hannah.
Thank you for those informative comments, Dan. Next on my list is Peter.
Good. I actually had a question about registration. More curiosity than anything. Is there any situation that would garner the licensing of more dentists in an emergency, or are we definitely out of that category? Is it, I understand nurses, I understand doctors, and there could be others, pharmacists maybe. Are we completely free of that?
Alan, I see your hand up. Am I going to you for that, or did you want to be on the list?
No, you can. We would need a regulatory change under our registration regulation to authorize an emergency form of registration. The requirements for registration are currently non-exemptable. You have to meet them, and we don't have an emergency class as some colleges do.
Mm-hmm. Hannah, if you don't mind though, Peter, was your question whether a situation would arise, practically speaking, when that would come about?
Is there ever any situation that you foresee we'd have to make some quick changes and, I don't know, a war maybe, or who knows what,
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's one that Dan and I were trying to kick around as we were initially going through this. And there wasn't anything specific that came to mind. I mean, I guess never say never. And if we had the flexibility, it doesn't mean we have to use it. But certainly, I think we saw over the current emergency we've been grappling with, COVID-19, that dentists have had some involvement, of course, but looks very different depending. It's going to depend on the nature of the emergency, right? Like with COVID-19 being a respiratory illness, dentists haven't been sort of squarely implicated in that. They've been obviously a huge support and so on. But hard to, we were trying to kick around ideas and couldn't come up with anything specific. So hard to say.
Thank you. Joseph.
Yes, I just wanted to echo the comments that that Dan made. I think that would be definitely helpful to have that type of explanation about the hybrid model, about the benefits of the hybrid model, and what our experience has been as RCDSO. I think that would be excellent. So,
Thank you, David Mock.
I can be very brief too. First of all, I wasn't planning this, but this question about the exceptions that might come up, we don't have the same situation as medicine and nursing did for underserviced areas. This was dealt with probably maybe 10, 15 years ago in Newfoundland, and it was disastrous. So I would personally agree that for our profession, we not enter into it. I just wanted to reiterate something that I'm not sure came across clearly when Dan was summarizing. I think, and I don't know if it has to be in this document, but certainly we have to keep in mind that it's more than just, if we are going to an appointed board and appointed committees, and especially small appointed board, where it's a dozen people, only half of which are professionals, we not only have to consider the competencies that we've already worked on, but we have to consider, as others have mentioned, some attempt at a regionality or regional representation, because in this big province, needs and concerns aren't the same everywhere. We also have to include consideration of varying experiences amongst the professional appointees, so that we don't have a uniform body, that we want to bring in all the experiences and therefore backgrounds. I just wanted to reiterate that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I've got 8 more people on my speakers list, and just a friendly reminder, it is 7:53 and we are hopeful to end this meeting by 8. So just putting it out there. So Rod, you're next.
I'll keep it brief. Dan, Andrea, is it possible to see the revised response? And I know that's a big ask before you submit.
Rod, I think we will do our best. We're working against the clock. And I think what we wanted to do was work with Sandy and the executive committee as a proxy for council. We will try to provide something, but I'm just, we have to look at some timelines in terms of how we get it to council and give time to respond and still make the 23rd. But we'll have to take that back and look at the extent of the changes that we're actually talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Nancy?
I had a quick question just for further clarification under the section of expediting registration in emergencies, in particular, the transition of registrants where practice restrictions should be placed on certificates of registration for dentists who have not met all requirements for registration. Who will be responsible for ensuring that they will not be doing things that are outside of the terms or conditions or limitations?
So Hannah, I can jump in. I think, Nancy, we didn't get into that level of detail, but I think what we were contemplating there is just trying to float to the ministry the concept that if we are, if they're going to allow colleges to do this, so allow a registrant to enter into the profession and treat people when they haven't completed all the standard elements, there needs to be some, for lack of a better word, there needs to be some controls in place. Mm-hmm. So I think that's detail to be determined, Nancy, whether that's, for example, supervision, and you have, qualified dentists that would work with and supervise, and so that dentist would ensure compliance. Who knows? That could be one option. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
David Bishop.
Yes, my question is on the composition of the new board of 6 and 6, that the possibility is that the public members could actually become a president, vice president, and so forth. How would the professional people view that?
So that's just a question you're putting out there, right? You're not,
Yes.
okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Sandy.
Hanno,
Oh, yes, Alan?
the public members can be president and vice president now. That's not a change.
Okay, thank you for that
Under the
clarification.
bylaws.
I think the comment was with a very small board of only 6 people, it might be viewed as being one-sided, whereas we have a larger number of people, and that doesn't seem to be an issue. Yes, I acknowledge that we can have public members in that, but there's a greater chance that they could very well take over the college.
Thank you. Sandy.
So Hannah, just another, I know with our time, but if council's okay, I know there's a lot of good discussion, if they'd be okay for an extra 10, 15 minutes, because I'd like everybody's voice to be heard. If everyone's okay with that, and I'll make a quick comment. I also, in hearing the comments and the discussions, I thank everyone very much for, their inputs. And looking at it, at the end of the day, we're all here for the same reason. Government, colleges, we want to be able to do our jobs effectively. What is an effective director? That's the question at the end of the day. And I think the secret sauce for us has been, we've been very intentional in everything that we have done. The reason the hybrid model works for us is that we instituted that eligibility and competency. Again, we're targeting in who is allowed to sit around the table, but we don't just stop there. Once they're at the table, again, we are very intentional of developing the talent that is around the table. And there'll be more of that coming forward this year, where we're setting expectations for us as a council member. What do we need to do? So I think government, yes, I understand what they're trying to do on packaging everything to look, uniform, and thinking that that's the secret, but that's not the secret. It comes down to the individual people and how it works and how it functions. So I think let's not lose sight of that. That is really how you provide the oversight, is really developing the people that are at the table. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Jamie?
Sandy.
Jamie, we've just lost you. I think you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sandy, you made some really excellent points there. And reacting to your comment, Dan, if it is a foregone conclusion that much of this will be passed through, then we should make some comments on the selection and the criteria and the composition of this reduced board. I'm not, do we have a particular position on how the selections will work? That's my question. And I hope we are proactive in terms of asking government, what is that going to look like? Is it going to be a selection committee made up of members of government? I think the college deserves some answers on who's actually going to be making decisions on selection.
Jamie, there is some commentary on that. Andrea can speak to what's already in the letter.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Jamie. In the draft response, Jamie, in that section, what we have set out is some comments about the selection committee, that it should be a statutory committee, which means that the provisions, creation of it is set out in the RHPA, terms of reference, composition. We've provided some recommendations about the composition and have recommended that it be made up of external individuals, similar to our eligibility review committee, and that it is colleges, not government, who should appoint that selection committee. So we've been able to provide some shape to it. Obviously, at this stage, it's still largely conceptual, and more detail would come later when we get legislative change that we can sort of sink our teeth into, but that is the content we provided.
Okay, thank you. Next on my list is Mark Trudell.
Thank you, Mano. I had actually lowered my hand because the comments I was going to offer up have just been addressed by Sandy and by Jamie. For my part, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that there will be an opportunity to advance a number of the concerns, including the hybrid model. I believe the comment was made earlier that this document is, we didn't take a pushback approach. We are taking an approach that I won't say welcomes, but acknowledges and offers constructive, thoughtful suggestions. But we've avoided getting into the details. Somebody mentioned earlier that the devil's in the detail. I truly believe that, because just case in point, the last comment about the nomination or election committee, that committee, we could advance a proposal where that committee, with respect to the nomination of the professional members, would turn exclusively to the college and the members of the college, the professional members of the college, to nominate unto themselves the 6, or whatever the math, the 6 or 10 professional members to the newly formed council. So I'm optimistic, I'm positive, and I believe we're dealing with this in exactly the right manner, non-confrontational. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, I have you on my list, but I don't see your hand up anymore. So do you have something you want to say or a question to ask? Richard, no? Okay.
No, my question was answered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So next on my list is Judy.
Thank you. I had an uncooperative mouse. I know this has been talked about already, but I did want to ask whether we can expect that the amendments to the draft will reinforce that many of us on council are not in favor of an appointed model, and the public interest considerations for that thinking, including geography and competencies, and whether or not it's appropriate, whether or not a smaller council will really serve the public interest with respect to the profession of dentistry. My feeling is that it won't, and that a lot of these, when they start setting up these limits, they're basically they're using a very cookie cutter approach to something that is far more complex than that. And that I'm also wondering if you're going to be questioning why public members cannot sit on statutory committees and provide some balance there.
Okay, thank you, Judy. I'm going to allow either Dan or Andrea or both to sort of, because I think there were some key questions in there. If you, either one or both of you want to take an opportunity to address what Judy just raised, please.
Yeah, thank you, Hanno. I may start, and I know Dan will come in. Judy, I had a question just about the very last thing that you said, because I'm not sure. I just want to make sure that I understand your point. The point you were making about statutory committees, could you just repeat that? I don't think I follow. I didn't really follow what you were saying. I wonder if you could.
Okay, I asked my question earlier, and I understood your response, but the point is that the government slides basically say that there would be no public members on statutory committees. So for us to assume that there will be is, I think, a faulty assumption. And so what I'm saying is, can that be included as a concern? I mean, my overall concern is that I think there's a lot of good stuff in this document. In the last 3 sections, I think the first section is problematic for me, and I don't really want to be. I wouldn't like to see us put forward a document that doesn't reflect the concerns that I've raised and others have raised about this section.
Okay, so if I'm just again, before I get to your broader points, so what I'm hearing is, I think something similar to what Joseph raised earlier is maybe raising the question about, is the intention to have public members, or just clarify public members need to sit on statutory committees, something of that flavor. I'm hearing, is that hitting the mark on the statutory committee piece?
What would meet the mark on the statutory committee piece is that we think that having public members sit on statutory committees is in the public interest, in that it provides the balance to the perception of professional self-interest.
Sure. Okay, that's great. We can definitely build that in. In terms of the broader comments that you were making about, the first section as opposed to the other 3 sections, I'll let Dan comment. I think certainly, as Dan summarized, we've heard your comments around yours and sort of all of Council's around the appointed model, around geographic representation. I think that the competencies, I just want to remind Council though, the concept of diversity in the ministry's deck accounts for geographic diversity, accounts for diversity on a number of fronts. So we can go back and look at that and just make sure that that's covered off. If it's not covered off, of course, we can flag that because we've heard that as a really consistent theme. In terms of how much you push back on the governance, obviously we're listening to you. You've heard Dan and I both say the reason why the draft was framed the way that it is. Dan specified a number of the changes that we're going to include. So I think it's really a question of, are people content with that? And to think through the implications of pushing back further and more rigorously on the governance elements. But yeah.
Can I just say that I think that the broader concept of competencies will be hard to find in 6 people, public and professional.
Okay.
Dan, did you want to comment?
Thank you.
No, I think Andrea captured it.
Okay, thank you. So on my list right now, I have Peter, Joseph, and Rod. I don't see all 3 of your hands up. So next on my list was you, Peter. So did I just write your name down incorrectly, or do you have something you would like to say right now?
Yeah, no, I've said my bit, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So next I've got Joseph.
Yes, just to amplify the point that Judy had made, the last point about public members sitting on both council and statutory committees. That's what I had mentioned earlier, that there is a benefit for them to be on both.
Okay, thank you. And Rod, you're the last speaker on my list. Oh, no, you're not. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you again all for your considered comments and questions. At this point in time, I would like to ask that the motion be placed on the screen for us all to see. And the motion to be considered at this point in time is that Council approve the draft RCDSO submission to the ministry, subject to any amendments requested by Council, and direct that the submission be forwarded to the ministry in accordance with its February 23rd, 2022 deadline. And could I have a mover for that? Moved by Nalin, seconded by David Bishop. Any further discussion? Ben?
Yes, thank you, Hanno, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make sure that the draft is amended. At least I want Dan and Andrea to acknowledge that the draft is amended to include comments regarding our experience with the hybrid model, and as well as the concerns of Council regarding the appointed model. Thank you.
Dan?
I said that earlier in terms of we could provide some commentary on the hybrid model, and we could talk about concerns. So yeah, I think I acknowledged that earlier, but thank you, Ben.
Thank you, and thank you for reiterating that again, Dan. So there are no hands up or questions. So what I am going to ask for your indulgence is we are going to take a vote. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. I'm going to ask you to keep your hand up until we can take account, because I'm going to go between two screens. So please do not lower your hand if you're in favor of this motion until I ask you to. So with the motion again, I'll just reread it, is that council approve the draft RCDSO submission to the ministry, subject to any amendments requested by council, and direct that the submission be forwarded to the ministry in accordance with its February 23rd, 2022 deadline. All those in favor, please raise your hand now. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay, so I've got that as a yes. Dan and Andrea, are you seeing that as well?
Yes.
Okay, so I will ask, any opposed? Abstentions? And that motion is carried. So thank you, council. A brief reminder that our next meeting will take place virtually on March 10th, 2022. I would like to take an opportunity to thank you all for attending this special meeting and taking the time out of your busy schedules to do so, particularly in light of the timelines that you were given. It was, however, I think a really important opportunity for you to provide input and for that to be incorporated in the document that will be moving forward. I would also like to echo Sandy's comments in thanking you as a council for the involvement today, for the attention and time that you took to prepare yourself for today's session, and for the considered comments, questions, and concerns that you raised. I would also like to take an opportunity to thank staff for all the incredible work that they've put into this, and not only into the document, but in organizing this live stream video version. To members of the public who have joined us, thank you for attending. And we are now ready to adjourn the meeting. So again, could I have a mover to adjourn the meeting? And I've got David Mock, all in favor. And I see lots of hands up, so that motion is carried. So again, thank you all for attending. The meeting is adjourned. Stay safe, and we will see you all on March 10th. Thank you.
Good night, all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Adam.
Good night.
Night.